Don Lattin is an award-winning journalist whose work has been featured in many publications, including the San Francisco Chronicle and the Los Angeles Times. He is a consultant for news programs on CNN, NBC, and PBS. Mr. Lattin is considered to be an authority on religious leaders, movements, cults, and now drug experimentation in our backyard. His previous books are Jesus Freaks, Following Our Bliss, and he is the co-author of Shopping for Faith. He is also probably a very popular professor of religious writing at the Graduate School of Journalism at UC Berkeley. And now, will you please join me in welcoming Don Lattin?
Thank you very much. What a great turnout! Wow, this is far out, as we used to say back in the '60s. You know, I was in Cambridge about a year and a half ago doing some interviews for the book, and it's great to be back. I kind of feel like I'm returning to the scene of the crime here. Right after this, I'm going to up to Millbrook, New York, where some of you may know Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert. That's where they landed after they got kicked out of Harvard in 1963. So I'm kind of following their footsteps. But it's really right here in Cambridge where this whole long, strange trip began in 1960, the fall of 1960, and that's a half century ago. Which just kind of, I just realized that a few days ago. We're closer to 2060 than we are to 1960 this year. That's the dividing point, but we're still talking about the 60s. This is my second reading of the book. The first one was in Marin County last week, just across the Golden Gate Bridge from San Francisco, which is where I live. But the first 4 chapters of the book take place in and around Cambridge. And then after that, the action shifts out to San Francisco around 65, when everyone came to San Francisco with or without flowers in their hair. And the center of the psychedelic cyclone kind of shifted from Boston to Baghdad by the Bay, as my old colleague at the Chronicle, Herb Cain, used to call our city. But before I get to the book, I wanted to start out by just addressing a rumor that's already going around about the book. I don't know who started this rumor, but someone says that there's on page 108, there is 250 micrograms of LSD sprayed on the upper left-hand corner. Now, I want to say unequivocally that is not true. And as a matter of fact, I tore off the corner of that page about an hour ago. And let me just say that there's absolutely no change. The white light. Look, everybody, look at the white light. I mean, maybe it's, I'm sorry. It's been a crazy couple of weeks for me. This is my 4th book. I've never had, this much media interest and early sales like we've had the first week, and it's kind of mind-blowing, pardon the expression again. The New York Times had a real nice review last Friday, which, I mean, I'm still kind of floating from that. There's a wide range of interest. Just a few days ago, I was on this show Coast to Coast. It's an AM radio syndicate, like 200 AM stations across the country. It used to be the Art Bell show. And yeah, and I was on from 11 p.m. to 2 a.m. West Coast time. So that's 2 a.m. to 5 a.m. here. You'd be amazed, they say, how many people are up and listening to this show, which is devoted to the paranormal, UFOs, New Age mysticism, and vast government conspiracies. So it was an interesting 3 hours, and I'm just kind of recovering from all that. So, it's just a weird. I've been a newspaper reporter for a long time, but recent years I've been writing books, and it's a weird business because the last year or so I've just been in my basement in my pajamas, finishing this book, and all of a sudden it's like bright lights, big city, nonstop talking. So if I'm a little spaced out, that's that's why. It's not the acid from page 108. I've gotten about a dozen reviews so far. They've been all good except for one, which was in SF Weekly, which is kind of not really the Phoenix of the Bay Area. That's with the Bay Guardian, but an alternative weekly. And the guy, I think, was set up to hate the book because you can tell from the first sentence it was, what was it? Oh, yeah. Yes, another 60s history. So when it starts out like that, you know it's going to be all downhill no matter what you say about the 60s. And I can understand that sentiment because, you know, if I was in my 20s or early 30s, I think I'd be sick of listening to all us old timers talk about the great old days of the 1960s. So I understand that sentiment, but well, enough preliminary banter. Let me talk a little bit about the book. Actually, that sort of leads to a question that maybe some young people might have, or old people for that matter, about this. I mean, what do 4 relics from the 60s, the characters in my book, have to do with the way we're living our lives today? In other words, why the hell should I read this book? So let me briefly count the ways that I think Timothy Leary, Ram Dass, Houston Smith, and Andrew Weil, and really the whole counterculture of the 1960s, in particular the psychedelic part of the counterculture, matter to us living here today, and how we can see that in things happening right now. So this is just a partial list, but yoga studios on practically every corner in the Bay Area, and probably around here too, and maybe even in Topeka, Kansas. Steve Jobs in Silicon Valley. One interesting aspect, I don't go into it in a lot of detail in this book because there's been another book written about it, but the guys in the early Silicon Valley computer revolution were influenced by psychedelics. Steve Jobs, actually the guy who invented the mouse, he was actually turned on by a guy named Jim Fadiman, who was turned on by Richard Alpert very early on. And he says he got the idea for the mouse because of new way of thinking because of psychedelics. So that's one way. Organic produce in your local supermarket. Deepak Chopra, the environmental movement. People who say they're spiritual but not religious. Doctors who prescribe meditation for cardiac patients. The Unabomber. Long story. The sexual revolution. Wayne Dyer, medical marijuana. Ecstasy-fueled raves. Esalen Institute, out here Omega Institute, and really the whole way we think about life, death, and the nature of reality itself. So before, I can't really explain all those in this short talk, well, that's why you have to buy my book, but here's the bottom line. I mean, millions of people in my generation, and by that I mean the baby boomers, took LSD and other kinds of psychedelic drugs in the 1960s, and we, including myself, had some profoundly enlightening and or sometimes simultaneously terrifying, soul-shattering experiences on these drugs that I don't think we all really quite understood, in the sense that, sure, we had these amazing experiences perhaps, and these terrifying experiences, but what happened after the ecstasy? You know, how did psychedelic drugs change the way we actually live our lives? Did they make us better people? Did they make us more aware people? And to me, that's the important question. The book's not about me. I do have an afterword where I talk about some of my own experiences, and I struggle whether to put that in there or to come out of the closet, and I'm coming out of the closet on this. But, my long, strange trip kind of began really in high school, which in my case was the late 60s, when I read the last novel that Aldous Huxley wrote, which was Island, which was about this cynical reporter who's shipwrecked on an island, and he goes native, kind of like Avatar, same story, same storyline. He goes native, and they take this Moshka medicine, and they live in cosmic harmony with the cosmos and themselves. And of course, the cynical reporter, goes native. And now, Island, I reread that when I was starting to work on the book, and it didn't actually fare too well with the passage of time. It wasn't Huxley's best novel by any means, but that book got me interested in The Doors of Perception, which is a book that Huxley wrote in 1954 about his experiences on mescaline in the spring of 1953. And he was given mescaline by a doctor, Dr. Humphrey Osmond, a British researcher who had done research on LSD and alcoholism and other things. And he was guided on that trip by Osmond. They actually coined the word psychedelic together. And they had several different words that they thought about using, and they would make up little couplets and rhymes to see how the words sounded in a sentence or in a poem. And the word for psychedelic, their poem for psychedelic was to fathom hell or soar angelic, take a pinch of psychedelic. And that sort of sealed the deal, I guess, with that word. Well, I was in utero in New Jersey when this happened, when Huxley had his baptismal trip in his home in the Hollywood Hills in the spring of 1953. And he later wrote in The Doors of Perception about staring down at his gray flannel trousers, the isness of his trousers. And he looked at the curtains in his library, and they reflected the miraculous fact of sheer existence. And it's just all so beautiful, another expression we used to say back in those days. Well, the Doors of Perception gave birth to the psychedelic drug culture, and it also, I think, sparked something in me personally, which was a desire to alter my state of consciousness in a different way than the beer and pot parties I used to go to in high school, which was to take a deeper look into my own heart and mind. And there would be many such journeys for me in ecstasies and agonies. And some of those trips were profound, joyous. Others, one in particular, was a terrifying experience, which I read about in the afterward, where I basically had a psychotic break and didn't come down for a couple weeks and had flashbacks. Yes, flashbacks are real. I used to think they were anti-drug propaganda, but no, they're real. And it was a very difficult time in my life for a period of a few weeks or maybe even months. And this happened to me in the fall of 1972 when I went to UC Berkeley to start college, about 10 years after the events I'm writing about in the book. And I mean, that bad trip scared the hell out of me. It really did. And I swore I would never do psychedelics again. A few months later, but I want to make it clear that I think these drugs can be dangerous, especially psychologically dangerous. And I'm not advocating people use them haphazardly by any means. So I really want to make that clear. Plus, most of them are illegal too. But hey, I sort of fell in with an older crowd, people who were about 15 years older than me, who had lived through the best part of the 60s in San Francisco. I always thought like I'd missed the good years, the early years. And I was the kid who wanted to keep the party going. Keeping my friends, experiencing all these things and tripping and all that. And I probably played that role a few more years longer than I should have. But, my love and fear of these drugs led me to finding some other ways, some kinder, gentler ways to explore the realms that we're talking about here. And it sparked an interest in me in religious mysticism too, which is one of the reasons I think I became a religion reporter for the secular press. I worked for 25 years as the religion reporter for the San Francisco Examiner and the San Francisco Chronicle. And it was partly these experiences that got me interested in that originally. But in the end, I realized it's not about the drugs. I mean, it's about taking those experiences we have, like the wonder, the awe, the feeling of interconnectedness, and finding a place for that in the rest of our lives. That I think is what is important. And the four guys I'm writing about in this book, the Harvard Psychedelic Club, they all had their own way of coming to grips with the craziness of the 60s and the 70s and bringing that into their lives. So first of all, since it did start right here, I want to do two readings from the book. The first one is pretty short. And it's about when these four guys crossed paths at Harvard in the fall of 1960-61, which was, an extraordinary time in American history. It was, as mentioned in the introduction, there was a time of sort of, optimism and vigor. And there was a young guy like no one before him had been swept into the White House, and everybody was talking about hope and change. And does that sound a little familiar? Yeah. So we just get a drink, and I'll do the first reading. So this is from beginning of chapter 4. I mentioned the first 4 chapters basically take place here. And this is chapters titled Crimson Tide. And it's about the role of the Harvard Crimson, which I think is like right around the corner, right? And Andy Weil in this whole affair, bringing down Richard Alpert and Timothy Leary. It was a heady time to be the editor-in-chief of the Harvard Crimson. You sat in a chair into which the name of one of your predecessors, Franklin D. Roosevelt, class of 1904, was carved in wood. The White House was occupied by another Harvard man and former Crimson editor, John F. Kennedy, class of 1940. Quote, if the Crimson didn't show up at the White House, we'd get calls from Schlesinger's office or Bundy's office, recalled Joseph Rusin, referring to Kennedy aides Arthur Schlesinger Jr., class of 1938, and McGeorge Bundy, who served as the dean of the faculty at Harvard before Kennedy tapped him as national security advisor. Kennedy's presidency, the rise and fall of Camelot, was the backdrop for some of the most extraordinary scenes and events in the lives of Houston Smith, Andrew Weil, Richard Alpert, and Timothy Leary. Kennedy was elected in the fall of 1960, the same season that Andy Weil and the Harvard class of 1964 moved to Cambridge and began their undergraduate studies. On the very day that Kennedy defeated Richard Milhous Nixon and was elected president, November 8, 1960, Aldous Huxley and his psychedelic connection, Humphrey Osmond, met Leary at a Boston restaurant and decided to work with him on the Harvard psilocybin project, as it was called then. Rusin was the president and editor-in-chief of the Harvard Crimson at the height of the Kennedy presidency. He would graduate, get hired by Newsweek, and head out to Berkeley in 1964 to cover the free speech movement, the campus protests at the University of California that kicked off a decade of unrest at schools across the nation. Just a year earlier, at Harvard, such a thing was inconceivable to Rusin. Quote, "Going to Berkeley was a big cultural change for me. It was a totally different place. Berkeley was action and organizing. Gestures mattered more than well-reasoned arguments, which is the way we did things at Harvard." Rusin's last big story at the Crimson would involve two psychology, a lecturer and professor named Alpert and Leary. But a staff writer named Andy Weil proposed the investigation and did most of the digging. To Rusin, it seemed like a strange story for Weil to be covering. Until then, Weil had mostly done arts coverage for the paper, theater reviews and things like that. He had also worked as an editorial writer on the opinion page. Weil is best remembered not for his Crimson journalism, but as an overweight, cigar-chomping, practical jokester. At the time, a rivalry raged between the Crimson staff and the kids over at the Harvard Lampoon. The famous satirical magazine had a statue of an ibis on the top of its building. "Andy stole the bird," Rusin said. "Then we'd take pictures of it in various locations and send the photos over to taunt the Lampoon." So that's how people remember Andrew Weil at Harvard, at least in the early years here. But Weil was not kidding when it came to his opinions about Leary and Alpert's research project. Quote, "Andy came to me when I was president of the Crimson and told me that he thought we really ought to take a look at what Leary and Alpert were doing," Rusin recalled. "They were giving LSD to students," which is actually not true, it was psilocybin, but they were giving psychedelics to students who were, at that time, who were undergraduates, including some who were psychologically on the fence, some of whom were going nuts. There was a guy on the Crimson staff who had been hospitalized for a mental condition after getting LSD from Leary and the Alpert crowd, which I was never actually able to confirm or find that guy, but that's what Rusin remembered. Andy thought that there was more of this, and either way, they were not following the deal they made with the university, which was not to give the drugs to undergraduates. Leary began this research project, and he was, wait a minute, I'm sorry. He began this research project. He was trying to see, he's giving these drugs to graduate students, convicts, and seminarians. I mean, the seminarians were at Andover Newton Theological Seminary. It was something called the Good Friday experiment. While I'll get to that later, actually. Cambridge was, and they were basically, the graduate students were writing up reports about their experiences on these drugs for Leary and Alpert. And while Cambridge was losing some of its best and brightest to the Kennedy White House, some other interesting characters were coming in to take their place then. And some of them are in my book. One is Allen Ginsberg, the crazy, gay, radical Jewish poet who just happened to be in town. He's always in town when something is happening in the 60s and 70s. He was crashing at Leary's house over in Newton. William Burroughs, the writer and heroin addict, was staying up in Leary's attic, and we can sort of guess what he was up to. Aldous Huxley, the great British essayist and explorer of human consciousness, was in Cambridge just happened to be in Cambridge for a couple of months. It was amazing how all these people came together at that time. He was at MIT giving a series of lectures, the centennial at MIT. And I mentioned, Leary and Huxley met the night Kennedy was elected, and then 1,000 days later, the day that Huxley died in his house in the Hollywood Hills on November 22nd, 1963. which is the same day that JFK was gunned down in Dallas, exact same day. That's why a lot of people never saw Huxley's obituary. Huxley had been ill for a few months, and a few hours before his death, his wife Laura injected him with a moderate dose of LSD to usher him into the next world. And Timothy Leary had flown out the week before and given the LSD for that purpose. So I wanted to do another reading, which is a bit longer. I want to leave time for questions. This is the story of Timothy Leary's first psychedelic trip, which is really what started all this. This is from the beginning of chapter 2 of the book, which is titled Turn On. And it's Cuernavaca, Mexico, in the summer of 1960. Timothy Leary brought the bowl of mushrooms up to his nose and sniffed. The smell reminded him of musty New England basements, or perhaps the downed tree rotting in a damp forest. It was now or never. He slowly placed one of the black moldy things in his mouth and followed up fast with a cold chaser of Mexican beer. The mushrooms tasted worse than they smelled, bitter and stringy, and before he had time to change his mind, he stuffed the rest of them in his mouth and washed the mess down with a few gulps of a familiar and more refreshing intoxicant, alcohol. It was supposed to be just a regular summer vacation, some time to relax before starting the new academic year. Leary and his son Jack, now 10 years old, scouted out the city of Cuernavaca and found a villa for rent, a rambling white stucco house with scarlet trim next to a golf course on the road to Acapulco. Cuernavaca, a name that comes from the Aztec word for place near trees, had been known in more recent times as the City of Eternal Spring. Its temperate year-round climate made the place a popular getaway spot for many famous Americans, including Hollywood heiress Barbara Hutton, Chicago crime boss Sam Giancana, and the German-born humanistic psychologist Erich Fromm, who studied social customs in a Mexican village just down the road from the Leary Villa. Professor David McClellan, the man who offered Leary his post at Harvard, was on retreat and working on a book in nearby Tepoztlan, about 10 miles away. The scholar who would have the most impact on Leary's summer vacation and the rest of Leary's life was a University of Mexico linguist and anthropologist named Lothar Noth, who was in the area translating ancient Aztec texts. Leary was renting the Spanish-style villa named Casa del Moros after a wealthy Arab who had built the place, with two friends from San Francisco, Semantitus Dick Dettering and his pregnant wife, Ruth. They had settled in and were waiting for the arrival of Frank Barron and Richard Alpert. Noth, the University of Mexico anthropologist, had been hanging around the villa. They didn't really know him, but he started hanging around and enjoying the swimming pool and all the lively conversation that they were having. In one of the conversations with Leary, Noth mentioned that he knew a woman named Crazy Juana, an old curandera, a Mexican shaman, who collected magic mushrooms on the slopes of Toluca, a nearby volcano. Leary remembered how Barron had been talking last year in Italy about the wonders of these mysterious fungi. Maybe that's just the ingredient they needed to spice up the summer vacation. Why don't you see if you can find some? Leary's mushroom connection delivered on the afternoon of August 9th, 1960. Botanists classify these fungi as Psilocybe cubenus, but the Aztecs call them Tianactal, the flesh of the gods. Psilocybin mushrooms and the secret indigenous religion that surrounds them had been mostly unknown to the American public until an event 3 years earlier when Life magazine published a long and very sympathetic story in its issue of June 10, 1957. The piece was written by R. Gordon Wasson, a New York banker and amateur mycologist who liked to travel the world with his exotic Russian-born wife in search of exotic mushrooms. The richly illustrated article in Life recounts the adventures that Wasson and his photographer friend, Alan Richardson, had in southern Mexico in the summer of 1955 when they became, quote, the first white men in recorded history to eat the divine mushrooms, close quote. With the help of a local guide, Wasson and Richardson found a bountiful harvest in a damp ravine in the Mixteco Mountains. They brought some of the musty plants to a thatched roof adobe home of Eva Mendez, a local curandera. Quote, This is Wasson speaking. I love this quote. "We showed our mushrooms to the woman and her daughter. They cried out in rapture over the firmness, the fresh beauty and abundance of our young specimens." Beside the altar, adorned with flowers and icons, was an altar adorned with flowers, icons, pictures of Jesus and his baptism in the River Jordan. Wasson ate 12 of these mushrooms and began a night-long journey into worlds he thought he never knew, scenes that, quote, "seemed more real to me than anything I had seen with my own eyes." Quote from Wasson, They were in vivid color, always harmonious. They began with art motifs, angular, such as might decorate carpets or textiles or wallpaper of the drawing room of an architect. Then they evolved into palaces with courts, arcades, gardens, resplendent palaces, all laid over with semi-precious stones. Then I saw a mythological beast drawing a regal chariot. Later, it was as though the walls of our house had dissolved, and my spirit had flown forth, and I was suspended in midair, viewing landscapes of mountains with camel caravans advancing slowly across the slopes, the mountains rising tier above tier to the very heavens. That was Wasson's description. Well, 5 years later, sitting by a pool in a rented Mexican villa, Leary had his own encounter with the flesh of the gods. Dick Dettering and a couple of other guests joined him for the mushroom trip, while 2 people at the pool party decided to abstain. One was Ruth Dettering, who was concerned about the effects the drug would have on her unborn child. The other abstainer was a friend of a friend who'd also kind of shown up and was hanging around the villa the previous night. Leary called him Whiskers. He suffered from nervous fits and decided that an encounter with psilocybin mushrooms might drive him over the psychotic edge. Leary started coming on to the drug. At first, he couldn't stop laughing. There was Whiskers, sitting by the pool in bathing trunks pulled over flowered undershorts. On top of it all, he was wearing green garters, black socks, and leather shoes. Whiskers had decided to take some notes while the rest of the crew tripped off to Mushroomland. So there was Whiskers, bent over a notepad, scribbling away like some Viennese shrink on speed. Leary could not stop laughing. Oh, the pomposity of scholars, he thought. The impotence of the mind. Leary got up and staggered into the house, then out to the pool on rubbery legs. Suddenly he remembered the kids, his kids. Who's watching the kids? What would the kids think? He called over to the sober Ruth. "This is hitting us hard," Leary told her. "You may have 6 psychotic nuts on your hand. I think you should send the kids downtown to the movies or something, and send the maid too. Get her out of here. Lock the gates. Stay close, and for God's sake, keep an eye on us." Leary was losing it. Someone asked, "How do you feel?" Leary couldn't speak. It was all too much. Everything around him started taking on the shimmer and glimmer of jeweled patterns. How do I feel? Far away, gone, far, drifting off, cavern of sea light. Making his way back to the house, he fell on the bed into the arms of another woman who'd taken the mushrooms. Bodies like warm foam rubber, marshmallow flesh, mermaids, laughing, poking fingers through bikini lace, quicksand flesh, dark hair, ponytail, princess, hummingbird words buzz from mouth. Stop talking, look outside. God, the undulating sea. Deep plants twirling together. Not even the plants know which leaf, which stem belongs to interconnect. Giant foam palm time. Oh, wow, my God. That's all in italics. Everything was in his head. Everything was quivering with life, even inanimate objects. Leary saw Nile palaces, Hindu temples, Babylonian boudoirs, Bedouin pleasure tents. Then came silk gowns breathing color and mosaics of flaming emeralds, followed by jeweled Moorish serpents. 3 hours passed like an instant. At one point, Leary realized that some friends had shown up from Acapulco. He slid back into the old reality, not really wanting to return, but knowing he had to play host, and that he was almost sober enough to pull it off. "We took some mushrooms," he explained to his startled guests. "Absolutely amazing. Why don't you guys go in the kitchen and make yourselves a drink? We'll get some supper in a bit." Another hour passed, and Leary was back from his visionary voyage. 7 psilocybin mushrooms and an ice-cold bottle of Carta Blanca. That's all it took. Leary was forced to confront the fragile nature of his beliefs. The mushroom ride shattered the foundations of his philosophy of life and his view of himself. What we call reality was just a social fabrication, a game. He would later call his trip the deepest religious experience of my life. So Leary came back here to Cambridge in the fall of 1960, and he was absolutely on fire. He was convinced that he was going to change the world. First revolutionized psychology, then change the world. Leary and Alpert eventually, and the rest of the gang, had profound experiences on these drugs, but they really knew nothing about religion or mysticism. These guys were secular scientists. They were clinical psychologists. They were not religious people, and they were having these religious experiences. So they wanted to bring Huxley in, because he was still hanging around giving his lectures at MIT as their theological consultant. But he was too busy, and Huxley recommended a friend of his, a young philosophy professor at MIT named Huston Smith. Smith had been writing about mysticism and meditating, but he'd never had a real mystical experience, and he wanted to try that. So he came over to Leary's house on New Year's Day, 1960-61, and Leary gave him a double dose of psilocybin. And Huston is 90, Leary's long gone, but Huston is 90 years old now. He lives in Berkeley. I interviewed him in his house. He just recently moved into an assisted living center. But when he talks about this trip on New Year's Day, his eyes light up like a little kid, and he says, "Oh, Don, what a way to start the 60s. Anyway, this research project quickly morphed into a spiritual crusade. The party started getting a little too wild for Huston Smith, who was, and is, after all, an ordained Methodist minister. Leary and Alpert had promised they would not use undergraduates as psychedelic guinea pigs. But Richard Alpert, who was a gay man living in the closet, couldn't resist the temptation to bring a few attractive young men into the fold, including an undergraduate named Ronnie Winston. Ronnie Winston was the son of Harry Winston, the wealthy diamond jewelry designer, manufacturer. And Ronnie was also a very good friend and dorm mate of Andy Weil at Clavery Hall. Is that how you spell Clavery Hall? But unlike Ronnie, Andy was not let in with the in crowd. He became jealous of Winston's most favored student status and took it upon himself to bring down Leary and Alpert. Working as both a spy for the Harvard administration and as a reporter for the Harvard Crimson, Weil went to Harry Winston, the father, and threatened to put his son's name in the newspaper unless he told the Nathan Pusey's office, the president of Harvard, that Professor Alpert had given him psilocybin. I mean, I'm a reporter. That's playing hardball. Also, he was working as both a spy for the administration and a reporter, which is kind of ethically questionable. Ronnie, there were other undergraduates who were involved in this, but none of them wanted to testify against Leary and Alpert because they were part of the project. They loved it. They didn't see anything wrong with it. But Ronnie, under the threat of having his name put in the Harvard Crimson and under pressure from his father, Harry Winston, went to Nathan Pusey's office and was asked, "Did Professor Alpert give you psilocybin?" And Ronnie Winston said reluctantly, "Yes, sir, he did. And it was the most educational experience I've had at Harvard." Well, they didn't care about that. They wanted to get rid of Leary and Alpert. I mean, this probably would have happened anyway because these guys were loose cannons. So while the deal was Weil and the Crimson would get the story first when they fired Alpert. And so Weil did the story along with a vicious editorial against Leary and Alpert that was also published the same day and co-written by Weil, where he called them like a virus infecting the campus community, and I mean some real vicious stuff. So Leary and Alpert were kicked out of Harvard. Leary was on a 3-year appointment. He was probably going to leave anyway, but he left a little early because of that. So they were suddenly out of a job and thrust into the national spotlight as the dynamic duo of the psychedelic revolution that was just starting to sweep across the country. So Weil would go on to graduate from Harvard Medical School and become the nation's leading proponent of complementary medicine. He calls it integrative medicine, bringing together the best of East and West, natural living and all that. Houston Smith would separate himself from the craziness and solidify his reputation as the nation's leading scholar of the world's religions. Alpert would go off to India and return famously as Baba Ram Das, one of the era's seminal spiritual teachers. Leary would be targeted by the CIA and the FBI and labeled by Richard Nixon as, quote, the most dangerous man in America, close quote, to which Leary replied, oh yeah, I got America surrounded. So Leary would get thrown in prison on a very minor drug charge, marijuana charge, only to escape with the help of the Weather Underground, be smuggled to Algeria, where he was sort of kept prisoner later by Eldridge Cleaver and the Black Panthers after a falling out with them. Then he escaped to Switzerland, then he was kicked out of Switzerland, and he went to Afghanistan, and he was kidnapped by the CIA and brought back and thrown back in prison. And the story goes on, but I want to leave some time for questions. So anyway, 50 years have passed since these events. And I talked with Ronnie Winston. I spent 3 days interviewing Ram Dass in Maui. He's still alive. He's had some health problems, some new ones lately, actually. But I spent 3 wonderful days interviewing Ram Dass in Maui. And I also talked to Andrew Weil. I interviewed him on his ranch in southern Arizona. There's no question about the facts of what happened in this story. There's no question. Andrew Weil is not, he's ashamed of what he did. He's tried to apologize many times over the years. He was an ambitious undergraduate, and he admits it. And he used that to propel himself at Harvard, to advance at Harvard. That's how the game is played. And Ram Dass, they've on the surface they've made up. Ram Dass and Weil have made up. Weil even did a fundraiser to help with some medical bills that Ram Dass had. But when you talk to him, he admits that he still hasn't really forgiven Andrew Weil for what he did back at the dawning of the age of Aquarius. And like the rest of us, for good or ill, we're still living with the fallout from all of that. So anyway, we got maybe 20 more minutes. So thank you for your attention. And, I don't know if I actually asked him that question. He's still he still remembers Ram Dass fondly. They hadn't spoken for a long time. I don't know if I actually asked him that particular question. I mean, I think in his case, like many cases, it was just something he tried once, and it was an important experience for him at the time. And he went on to go into his father's business. But I don't know if I asked him that particular question, so wish I did. The first part of the question, thanks. The first part of the question was about the CIA, and there's all kinds of fascinating stuff that's come out about the CIA's involvement in secretly funding all kinds of research with psychedelics in the 1950s and into the 1960s. And I didn't really get into that in this book because it's not really about that, for one thing. And there's been some other really great books already written about that, which I cite in the bibliography. So I didn't really go into it. The CIA did, when they got kicked out of Harvard, before they wound up at Millbrook, they went first down to Mexico. They were followed by the CIA. Documents later proved this was true. They were followed by the CIA down to Mexico. One CIA report accused them of setting up a happiness hotel in Mexico. And Ram Dass later said, we should have hired the CIA as our press agent. So, yeah, there was all kinds of incredible research with the CIA. So that's it, but I don't really get into it. And the other question about the Concord Prison Project, there's someone in the audience, Rick Doblin, who's actually did a fantastic follow-up study where he went back, both Good Friday, right, and he looked at, and the problem with that research, I think, if I understand it right, was that, yeah, they tripped with these prisoners, Leary and the graduate students, and they spent a lot of time with them, counseling them after they got out of prison, and sure, they reduced recidivism rates. If you just took people and didn't give them drugs and spent that much time helping them and counseling them, you would reduce the recidivism rate. So it was possible to really tell what effect was from the drug and what effect was from all the other attention that was showered on them. So there wasn't a what's the right kind of control group, I guess. Yeah, well, like I said, and like you just mentioned about what Houston said about psychedelics, the question is, you can have a religious experience, but do you live a religious life, a good life, a spiritual life, and what do you do with this experience? And I think Ram Dass is an example of someone who, he never renounced psychedelics. He probably still tripped every once in a while. But he basically, was inspired to help start a lot of different charitable organizations, including the ones that you mentioned through the Seva Foundation. He also showed a lot of us, I think, helped a lot of us understand these experiences and how to bring them into our lives and how to get something positive out of this. I mean, there was a lot of wreckage from this era, and a lot of, people never came back from some of these trips. And I think it was exaggerated. The dangers were exaggerated at the time because the propaganda of the, Nixon administration and all that. But yeah, I think Ram Dass did some great work. Yeah, I mean, all four of these guys stirred up the waters of social change in the 60s. But Leary never really found an anchor, in a way, I don't think. He went from this to that and this fad to that fad. He tried to walk on the water because, I mean, he was a megalomaniac. I mean, he had a messiah complex like you can't believe. I mean, this guy had the chutzpah to stand in front of a theater marquee in New York City with behind him on the marquee it said, "Timothy Leary, the reincarnation of Jesus Christ." I mean, that's not a messiah complex. Yeah, well, there's so many great little footnotes to this. The question is, didn't he end up with Gordon Liddy? Well, Gordon Liddy of Watergate fame was earlier than that. In the mid-'60s, was an assistant DA in Dutchess County, New York, where Millbrook was. And the first person to arrest Timothy Leary was G. Gordon Liddy, 10 years before Watergate. Liddy actually made his name for himself by getting Leary, because they wanted to get Leary. And he called himself G. Gordon Liddy, patterned his name after his hero, J. Edgar Hoover, by the way. That's why he used that first initial, middle name. And later, but see, Leary had a sense of humor. I mean, he was a brilliant guy. I mean, like many people, I could have a love-hate thing with the guy, when I really started researching this book. So later on, he became friends with G. Gordon Liddy after Liddy was famous for Watergate, and they went on the road together, a lecture circuit. Two guys trying to sell books, so, he had a sense of humor. These guys led such full and fascinating lives that there was so much material I couldn't even research, let alone put in the book. And the danger with this book was to not let Leary dominate it, because there's been so much written about Leary. There's been very little written about Andrew Weil's role in this, hardly anything. It's been mentioned a couple times, but not the details like I described. So I sort of, in a way, focused on the periods where they intersect. And so there's a lot, like the CIA, there's a lot of stuff that's obviously left out. Yeah, when I say 60s, I don't mean like 1960 to 1969. I agree. The funny thing is, we think about Leary and LSD, we see like Indian bedspreads, we hear the Jefferson Airplane, the Grateful Dead, all that. When these guys, none of that had happened yet. These guys were looking like, Mad Men, that great show. They were like little buttoned down, thin ties. Until 66, Leary was dressing like that. They were listening to Miles Davis. They weren't listening. The rock thing hadn't even happened yet. So it was a whole different era. But it really did start here. I mean, they set up these communes in Newton around Leary's house, and they were like the first, hippie communes that so many of us sort of lived in during college, in the 60s and 70s. They really did start something. There's no doubt about it. San Francisco gets a lot of the credit for it, but it really started here. There's a chapter in this book called Sinners and Saints, and it's 2 long sections. One is about the Concord Prison Project, which we already talked about, and the other is about the Good Friday Experiment, which, again, Rick, should have written that chapter. He did a follow-up. What it basically was is they had 20. I guess I think I mentioned it. Yeah. But you did a follow-up study, and basically you found that most of these people still remembered. Somebody asked me about Ronnie Winston's but probably the same. I would guess it would be the same. That these were profound experiences. They honored them. They didn't become drug addicts. They didn't take a lot of psychedelics. Some became ministers, some didn't. But it had a long-term positive effect on their life. It did. Leary became a government informant later in the 70s to get out of jail. Some people say he didn't give any real legitimate information, but I think he did get a couple lawyers in trouble who had worked for the Weather Underground or something, or the left. So a lot of people, it might have been, I don't know if it was Hoffman, but Jerry Rubin, they had a big press conference and Ram Dass was there denouncing Leary for this. Allen Ginsberg, and they also even brought Leary's son, Jack, to denounce him, which, most of them made up over the years, but people hated Leary for years after that. He was persona non grata. Well, actually, I said it didn't start out with the acid rock soundtrack, but it quickly became that. The music side of this, when the movie is made, and by the way, it might be, getting some calls, but anyway, the soundtrack, would be incredible because, well, John Lennon read The Psychedelic Experience, which was written by Leary Alpert and Ralph Metzner, who really should be on the cover of this book because he was the other member of the Harvard Psychedelic Club, but for various reasons he's not. But I did interview him, and he's a big part of the book. When Lennon had his first LSD trip, he was reading and using as a guide the book that Leary and Alpert and Ralph Metzner wrote. And then he wrote a song, Tomorrow Never Knows, right? Tomorrow Never Knows? Yeah, which is the last song on, I think, not Rubber Soul, Revolver, which was really, if I got my Beatles chronology right, it was really the first kind of sitar-infused psychedelics, a lot before Rubber Soul or Sgt. Pepper's, where you had the full flowering. So yeah, and then Come Together, the Beatles song Come Together, was written in a way originally as a campaign song. At least the idea for it was a campaign song. Leary ran for governor of California against Ronald Reagan. And the campaign song wasn't Come Together, but that was his motto, and Lennon got the idea from that. And Lennon later kind of renounced Leary. He said, well, that stupid book of Leary's, and he said some, nasty things about Leary. But of course, the Jefferson, all that was the West Coast scene, which was really a whole different scene. There were some connections. Actually, Alpert is the connection, because he was teaching at Stanford in the late 50s. The reason he wasn't there in the 1960s, he was at Stanford and/or Cal doing some teaching. So there are some connections, but the Ken Kesey thing was really a separate thing. And the funny thing is, there's a chapter in the book, If You Come to San Francisco, which is about when these guys from Harvard all come out in 1966. They had no idea this was going on out in San Francisco. They were still with their little ties and buttoned down, and they came out to deliver serious academic papers at a conference. And there's a story as a guy, Paul Lee, who worked with them. They had a party before the conference, and so all these guys from Harvard up in Marin County, and it was a big mansion in the foothills of Mount Tamalpais, and they wanted, it was a pre-conference party, and they thought it was going to be like a cocktail party, like we have at Harvard, and so they went out there, and they wanted to hire some appropriate music, for the party, and they hired the Grateful Dead, which had just started calling themselves the Grateful Dead at the time, and Paul Lee tells this great story where he was the main organizer, and he was out there, and they couldn't believe it. There were, little kids and grandmothers running around naked by the pool, and it was this, everybody, and Owsley, the infamous LSD chemist, was there in a powder blue jumpsuit, handing out LSD to anyone who wanted it, and Paul Lee didn't take any because he had to give this paper the next morning, and he had already tried it actually, but they were all leaning back, by the pool in the grass, waiting for the Dead to start playing, coming on to the acid. And one of the hosts announced, the neighbors need everyone to move their cars. We're blocking there's a horse stable next door. We're blocking the driveway. Everyone's just coming. So Paul Lee thought, oh my God. The whole conference is going to fall apart. People are going to go out. If they can get their keys into the ignition, they're going to start this game of psychedelic bumper cars. The police are going to come. We're going to all get arrested. The whole conference is going to be destroyed. But another miracle was that they all went out and orderly moved their cars, came back, and the band played on. So it all came out good. Yeah, I mentioned Hoffman, but I don't know if I might not have mentioned his book. But Leary and Hoffman had Hoffman had sort of a love-hate thing with Leary, too.
What happened to the Psychedelic Reader?
I don't. I've seen it. And then there was the Harvard Psychedelic Review, which I think was maybe before that. I'm not sure. And Ralph Metzner, I think, was maybe even the editor of that, not Leary. But like I said, there's so much. I just couldn't get in. I really had to skim across the top of the story to really get it all told. I mean, and especially after they leave Harvard. I mean, it's so much happened with all four of these guys. I mean, haven't even talked about Houston Smith, who's a wonderful man. He was born in China to the Methodist missionaries, and he's got a whole interesting story. It's in the book. I think these drugs, what you think you're going to experience, your expectations have a lot to do with what happens. And if you think it's going to be an Eastern mystical experience, I think it helps make it that. But more than Ginsberg, I think it was Huxley. Huxley's the one that gave them the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which was basically the book they used as the guide for the psychedelic experience, the book that they wrote and John Lennon used in his experience. Anyway, I think we want to have some time to sign books and all that. So thank you very much.